Today we're going to talk about shields, but more importantly we're going to talk about the whole use of them. And a couple of the things that we have to deal with, especially in the SEA, on the different types of shields and how they fight each other. We're a very unique group because we're doing something that has never ever been done before. We're taking not only different armor types, different weapon types, and different weapon systems, but we're placing them, as anachronists as we are, we're placing them in time periods that had nothing to do with each other. And we're finding out the results, which is pretty interesting. But because of that, we also find out a lot of the similarities between them. For instance, you're taking a Viking center grip from the 9th or 10th century, and you're fighting it with a heater shield from the 13th century, when the two never existed in time or fought each other. And you're having to, especially in the situations that they did fight each other with, you're seeing the results of those two. You know, it's a much more hands-on version of Deadliest Warrior, I guess, but with not the budget or the ballistic gel. And so what we find about these things is all shields have strengths and weaknesses. And because of that, we have to learn our own equipment. Too many times we go out there and fight, and not only are we trying to better ourselves by going to practice, but we're trying to figure it out as we go along, like everybody does. But we never really get a good grasp of what we're using, what they're using, and memorizing it as an art, and fighting it as an art. And that creates difficulty, because a lot of times we'll go into a match, the pass will begin, the fight will start, somebody dies, and you're like, oh, I won it. Awesome. And you walk off. This should never occur. You should intend the death of everybody you're fighting. It should be surgical, it should be precise, and it should be completely intended from beginning to end. That's how a fight should progress. And oftentimes, you know, especially with the new fighters, we see somebody calls lay on, they march,
Better.
they get this close, and they start swinging until somebody dies, which is a great way to start when you have fun. But once you want to start progressing with your fight, you want to know more about the fight, and you want to know more about why you're doing what you're doing. As any martial artist, we're always interested in not only the function, but the form itself. How can we practice this and replicate it? More importantly, how can we teach it to somebody who's just starting in an easier method, so they don't have to go through the 20-some years and thousands of miles and how many broken shields to figure out 2 years later, oh, that's what I was supposed to be doing. How can we condense that down? It is something that someone can understand, can replicate and repeat over and over again. And not necessarily make automatons of fighters, but give them a body of knowledge that's basic. One of the things in the SEA that we have a lot of hard time with is we call everything by different names. One person's A range, D range, E range is another person's aardvark range. Yes, I've heard aardvark range. Mississippi, not kidding. You know, and so we have all these different terminologies, thumb down, you know, Wuga, Milanese, all these different types of techniques and names for them. Just like any profession, there's a ton of different names for them. Everybody calls it by their short name. But because of that, you can't go from one area to the other and get the same amount of instructions, right? And so one of the things that I've tried to do over the last 10 years has been develop a system of actually teaching basics. I do that because when I first started in the SEA, I fell in love with it, like we all do. I fell in love with the chivalry, I fell in love with the courtesy, I fell in love with the idea of being a knight. But coming from an Asian-style martial arts background, one of the first things I noticed was we don't know how to teach it. One of the things, and some do, but for the most part, we get a lot of folks out there, we get together, and a new person comes out, we hand them a sword, hand them a shield sometimes, and we say, okay, get into a stance that's comfortable. This is comfortable for me. I can sit like this all day. But it's not necessarily a good stance for me to fight in. I'm probably going to die quickly. And so, just from the very basics, from the feet up, being able to talk to somebody and explain to them why you're doing the stance, why you're doing the position, why you're doing what you're doing with the shield, is very, very important. Because whatever you're telling them in the very beginning, they're going to relate to for every single thing they do later. Think of what your profession is, what you do for a living. If you started that profession by not learning any of the basics and went right to, say, the middle of it, you wouldn't be as creative as you are in the profession that you are, because you don't have any basics to rely on. You don't have any foundation to rely on. And for too many fighters and too many people in what we do, that's the case. We let fighters go out there and start flopping around, and they're not understanding what they're doing. When they get a hit, they get one. It's great. They don't know why. And oftentimes, we have fighters that will come off the field and can't articulate it very well. But not everybody has to. And there are a few common things that we can talk about, that we can go through, that are truisms for a lot of what we do. It doesn't matter what style. Now, today we are not going to go into power generation and how to throw a blow. I don't want any part of that myself, because how I throw a blow in power generation is probably different from most of it. It probably ends up in the same place, but there's a lot of reasons why we all do our different things. A lot of them are cultural. A lot of them are, something that the people fighting before us in the kingdom developed, and we go with it. And I am not of anybody's school. I'm not of Paul's school. I'm not of Sean's school. I'm not any of those schools. I have a completely different method. And after class or in the breaks, if you want to talk to me about it, that's great. We can do that. But what we're going to talk about is what we're seeing. The other thing that we do not address a lot, doesn't mean it never happens, but we don't address a lot, is what our opponent is using. And we always say, check out your opponent, right? See what they're doing. But do you know why they're using what they're using? And what are the strengths and weaknesses of what they're using? You must learn all the strengths and weaknesses of every weapon system you have, right? I'm a very big fan of one mind and a weapon. And because of that, we have to learn and develop an understanding of every single thing we see in front of us. Not just, what is it, okay, we fight that big shield like this, but where's it weak? Why is it there? And how are they going to use it? And how can we use it against them? And too many times we bypass that part. We don't see it for what it is. We don't always throw for their weak lines. This type of philosophy is kind of unique. In my experience of 33 years now, every martial art I've ever encountered is developed by what the defense of the opponent is. Every single one. You're always attempting to beat the defense of the opponent. That's truism through every martial art I've ever studied. And so, what we have to look at is why it's weak, and attack that weakness every single time. It's what martial arts are based on. You don't throw a lock to a position that the hand bends to already. You throw a lock to the position where the hand doesn't. Just like you shouldn't throw a blow to a place where the shield is strong already, you should throw a blow always to where the shield isn't strong, where it's weakest. Now, we're going to get into the strengths and weaknesses of the shield in a second, but the first thing we have to talk about is the first defense. And the first defense is measure. People call it range. Measure is a concept that's been talked about in every martial art in history. The Japanese call it the ma'a. The Europeans call it simply measure, but we have to remember we're talking about Aristotle's measure. In Aristotle's world, time, space, angle is linear. It wasn't screwed up by Einstein later, making everything relative. In other words, time-wise, you could sing, row, row, row your boat this fast, or this fast, speed metal version, and it's the same song. When you're talking about measure, you're talking about three components: distance, time, and length. This is your first defense. Before it ever gets to a shield, this is your first defense. So, Melissa standing here, and I'm standing here, and we're 10 feet apart. If I walk towards her, it can take 3 seconds. If I run towards her, it'll take a second. It's the same distance. And one of the things that we talk about, when you hear, I know Sean talks a lot about range, right? A range, B range, C range. I'm much more simpler than that.